There are cities where, for example, serial killers should probably relocate to. Good morning, friends, and happy Friday. In this video, we're going to discuss a fascinating subject, that is murder, homicide. In particular, we're going to discuss whether murder is easier to get away with in certain cities and states in the United States of America. But before we do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video for the sake of the algorithm. Now let's get started. First, let me introduce why I've been personally curious about this subject. You see, I've lived for several years in Los Angeles, California. Because I grew up in the 80s personally, I always had an idea of Los Angeles, California as being an unusually violent, murderous place. Indeed, in the late 80s, Los Angeles reached its height of violence. But ever since I've lived in Los Angeles, I've noted that it seems that most murders that we hear about get solved. The police seem extremely effective in Los Angeles. On the other hand, I've been hearing about murders going on brazenly in places like Chicago, Illinois, and Baltimore, Maryland. It seems like people get away with murders in those places. Is that actually true? This is the question that made me research this subject. And in researching it, I thought it would be fun to describe the subject as sort of a guide for killers, where a killer should live if they plan to get away with it. Of course, I'm not encouraging murder. Murder is a horrible crime, but I'm just trying to pose the question in an interesting way that can allow us to find the research curious and interesting to follow. To get started, let's discuss homicide detectives. Are homicide detectives, those are murder investigators, particularly instrumental in solving homicides? Or do homicides sort of get solved by random factors and eyewitness statements? The latter is apparently more true. In fact, this research has been going on for quite some time. The seminal paper published on this subject was published by the RAND Corporation. For those of you that don't know about RAND, Google RAND Corporation and maybe add conspiracy theory after RAND Corporation to find some interesting results. Anyway, the RAND paper discovered that the most important elements of a homicide in regard to its solvability are eyewitness statements given usually to the responding officer of the homicide, not work by actual homicide investigators. And by the 90s, academics thought that random circumstances related to a homicide were most influential in the homicide solvability. This was called the circumstance result hypothesis, to distinguish it from the effort result hypothesis, basically stating that irrespective of how much murder investigators really put effort into the problem, random features regarding the homicide are most important to its solvability. Meaning really mistakes by the murderer or eyewitness statements are most instrumental to the homicide solvability. And interestingly, within the eyewitness statements, the most important fact appears to be whether the community is willing to communicate what really happened to the police. But we'll get into that in a bit. Second, homicide investigators can get better, but they don't. A follow-up investigation by RAND a couple of decades later showed that police investigators, homicide investigators in particular, rarely implement new techniques to solve a crime. This is within the US, in contrast to, for example, in the UK, where homicide investigators are very ingenuitive and constantly changing their approaches. Fascinatingly, a 2018 study on the Boston Police Department found that interventions to the Boston Police Department's homicide investigative approach could improve homicide clearance rates, but usually didn't. By the way, I should probably define homicide clearance rates here. The homicide clearance rate is the rate at which new homicides are cleared per year. But usually the homicide clearance rate statistically account for all homicides marked as cleared that year and all new homicides that appear that year. So sometimes the homicide clearance rates actually usually involve solved homicides from previous years, therefore falsely inflating the homicide clearance rate. A homicide clearance rate of 70% indicates that 70% of the number of homicides that occurred that year were solved in that police station. Not necessarily of those homicides themselves though. Next, this study of homicide clearance rates has yielded some interesting results. For example, it's been shown that the number of cases a murder investigator has on their caseload is inversely associated with their clearance rate, such that when they have more cases, they're less likely to solve any individual case. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most important elements to a case's solvability is the willingness of the community to inform on themselves to the police. So specifically, the willingness, you could think of in colloquial terms of a community to snitch, such that in general, for example in Chicago, it is far harder to clear a homicide in an African American community than in a Hispanic community, and the reason seems to be due to the lack of trust the African American community has for the police. And finally, murders are less likely to be solved the longer the time has passed since the murder, and also victims who are from racial minorities or who live deviant lifestyles are less likely to be avenged by the police, meaning that victims who are, for example, African American or drug users are less likely to have their cases solved by the police. So what have we learned so far? Well, if you were a murderer operating 2022, you would likely want to live in a city with a large African American community. You'd likely want to be operating within that African American community. You'd like to choose a city that has a high homicide rate in general and a low homicide clearance rate in particular. Which cities fulfill these criteria? Well, before we get to that, let's talk about national trends in murder. First of all, US homicide clearance rates have dramatically declined in the last several decades. They've declined from around a 90% average in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, to around a 60% average in the early 2000s. By 2019, which is the most recent date for which we have detailed data from the FBI, homicide clearance rates were just above 60% nationally. They were higher in the Northeast and in the West, over 60%, whereas they were lower in the South and the lowest in the Midwest. So for example, in the Midwest, 57% of homicides incurred per year are cleared in number. Remember, these aren't the exact same homicides. Whereas in the Northeast, 66% were cleared, a major difference. And within the Midwest, the East, North, Central area has an even worse clearance rate that reaches 55%. So we've learned that the Midwest appears to be the place where murders get solved the least. Which cities might be responsible for this? First, let's look at Chicago. Chicago had an unusually low homicide clearance rate even very recently. In 2019, Chicago had a stated homicide clearance rate of 53%, well below the national average. But their real homicide clearance rate for crimes committed that year was much lower. It was actually 22%. So people who committed murders in 2019 in Chicago had almost a 1/5 chance of being caught, meaning they were almost 5 times more likely to not get caught as they were to get caught. Fascinatingly, statistical models of Chicago's homicide scene indicate that Chicago's homicides actually increased with the spread of technology and cameras in the last couple of decades. So 22% seems difficult to beat, but can it be beaten? Well, we have to look at Maryland. In Baltimore, Maryland, in 2019, the homicide clearance rate for homicides from 2019 was 21%, 1% less than Chicago. In fact, Baltimore's clearance rate from 2017 to 2020 was only 24%, only slightly better. And if you thought Baltimore was bad, there are cities that have even lower rates, but unfortunately haven't published their data recently. So for example, in 2016, Honolulu, Hawaii had a lower rate than even Baltimore in 2019. It had a homicide clearance rate of 19%. Not only that, but Flint, Michigan had a homicide clearance rate of 18%, meaning if you committed a homicide in Flint, Michigan in 2016, you were more than 5 times more likely to not get caught as you were to get caught. In fact, Michigan plays an interesting role in these rates. In 2016, 3 of the top 5 cities with the lowest homicide clearance rates, meaning the most murderers getting away with it, were in Michigan. Compared to these rates, cities in Louisiana like Baton Rouge actually have very good homicide clearance rates, and cities like Los Angeles and New York City have much higher homicide clearance rates, with estimates almost always being above 60%. And an even better contrast may be found in the countries of Western Europe, where the lowest homicide clearance rates are above 70%, like in the Netherlands, and the highest near 100%, for example in Finland. So friends, what have we learned from this unusual video? Well, first of all, homicide detectives' work is not that instrumental in catching a killer. The most important elements of a homicide are actually the random elements of the actual homicide, i.e. mistakes by the killer, and the willingness of the community to tell on that killer. Second, we learned that homicide detectives can get better and can be more useful, but they usually don't. And third, we learned that America solves a particularly low amount of its homicides, and those homicides are less likely to be solved in the Midwest. And finally, we learned that there are indeed cities in which it is far less likely for a killer to be caught after committing a crime. There are cities where, for example, serial killers should probably relocate to. These are cities like Baltimore, Flint, Michigan, Chicago, and so on. Anyway, friends, I hope you found this interesting, and I look forward to seeing you again this afternoon.